Hi, Andy here from Blue Rock Productions in England, UK. In this video, I'm going to show you how I converted an ordinary acoustic snare drum into an electronic drum by using an internal trigger. The trigger is made by a company called Trigera, and the actual model of the trigger is called an Intrig. Right, let's get started. Okay, so we're going to start with removing the snare wires from the bottom of the snare drum, as we won't be needing these. They're actually in very good condition, so I'm going to carefully put them to one side and keep them as spares. I actually have quite a few different snare drums, and this is one that I don't use very often, so I chose this one as my project for the conversion. It does look very nice. It's made by Yamaha, and it's a Yamaha Stage Custom wooden shell, 14 inches in diameter. The colour of the drum is emerald green, which looks really nice, and you can actually see the wood grain through the finish. Once I've stripped the drum down, I'm going to clean it up and make it all nice and shiny, put it back together again. It's going to look great. So I'll just continue removing the snare wires from the bottom of the snare drum on its bracket and put that to one side before we start removing the top batter head of the snare drum. So the next part of this video will show you how to remove the snare drum skins, which isn't particularly that interesting. So what I've tried to do is fast forward, speed up the video to get through that a bit quicker. And if all this is a little bit boring for you, then you can always skip this video and go straight to the video where I actually show you what it looks like, what it sounds like and how it performs. You'll actually see the drum in action. Okay, so we'll just continue here, removing the lugs from the top of the snare drum, and that will release the rim and the old snare skin. So the next task is to remove the resonant head, the bottom skin of the snare drum. And again, I'm going to speed this up because it's not that interesting. I'm sure you all know how to undo the screws and take off the skin. Now, one thing I really wanted to ensure was that this drum, when I've converted it, still looks like an acoustic snare drum. There's been lots of discussion about electronic drums looking like electronic drums and they don't look like acoustic drums, and I tend to agree with this. I like the look of acoustic drums. So one thing you will get when you remove the bottom skin is that the rim will just be loose and just flap around because there's nothing for it to hold on to. So I had to come up with an idea to be able to attach the bottom rim with some spacers on the lugs so that I could get a nice tight grip on the rim even though there's no bottom skin there. So what I needed was some spacers to fit to the lugs to take up the gap between the lug holder and the lug itself. So I looked around and found two old ballpoint pens, and I took the insides out of the pens and marked them into equal distances and cut them into pieces, and the lugs fit perfectly inside, making perfect spacers and will cost absolutely nothing at all. Right, you'll see here what I actually used, and you can see I cut the actual barrels of the pens with a junior hacksaw. So if you do the same, please be very, very careful and don't cut your fingers. But anyway, this solution worked for me. If you find something else, maybe something made of metal, which will be a bit stronger, then that's great. And perhaps if you do, you can share it and leave a comment for me. Right, it's time to attach the trigger to the inside of the drum. And I'll do this by using the two screws that you see on the inside of the drum shell. And these are the screws that actually hold the lug retainers to the outside of the drum shell. Only undo one of the screws at a time so that the lug holder doesn't actually fall off the shell when you're doing this. Okay, so when we've got two screws in place holding the trigger to the inside of the snare shell, make sure that the screws aren't fully tightened so that there's still some adjustment, because what we need to do next is to make sure the spongy bit at the top of the trigger is protruding slightly above the top bearing edge of the snare shell. Okay, when you're happy with that, you can tighten up both screws so that the trigger is firmly attached to the inside of the shell. So now it's time to put the top head on the snare drum, and I am using a Remo silent stroke mesh head, which I'll now proceed to put on the drum. I don't think there's any particular reason why you can't use your existing snare head, apart from the fact that it won't provide you with silent or near silent practice once you're using this as an electronic drum. However, I'm going to use the mesh head. It's a nice new head, and I've not tried one of these before. Okay, as before, I'm going to speed up this video, as I'm sure there's plenty of videos out there on how to tighten up a drum head. But just make sure you tighten it up to however you feel is best to get the right stick bounce, especially if you're using a mesh head. Okay, I'm happy with that. Looks fine. I can always make adjustments later on. So now it's time to turn the drum over and fit the bottom rim. Notice I didn't say fit the bottom skin. Now, if you remember those ballpoint pen barrels that I cut up earlier on, well, we're going to use those now and use them as spacers to attach the bottom rim. So if you are using plastic spacers like I am, then be very careful not to tighten them up too much. If you do, they will crack. Just tighten them enough so that the bottom rim doesn't rattle around, or the lugs don't rattle around on the rim when you're playing the drum. Okay, so we are now finished. We fitted the mesh head to the top of the snare, and we fitted a rim to the bottom using the plastic spacers so that it still looks like a snare drum. Okay, so I'm very excited to try this drum out now. So in part 2 of this video, you will see and hear me playing this snare drum, along with a kit of electronic drums with the emphasis on this particular snare drum, so that you can get an idea of how it performs. You will also find links to the website of the company who makes this trigger, called Trigera, and they also make electronic cymbals and a kick drum trigger as well.